The Beating of Wings. Jimmy Ben lay on his back looking at the full round moon through his window. It was 3 a.m, the same hour of his awakening for over a month. Something was coming for him, and he knew it. Jimmy lay quiet as a stone, just as he had every morning for the past several weeks. Cold beads of sweat trickled down his forehead. He breathed slowly, deliberately. He sensed the presence of everything that passed near or through his window, the charred aroma of the evening's cooking fire, the squall of a panther, the beating of wings, even the heavy odor of a water moccasin sliding through the mud at the yard's edge. Something was coming, something he must hunt or kill or face. In a flash of certainty, he knew what it was. He wondered how he could have gone a month without knowing. "The beating of wings," he said aloud. "It will come with the beating of wings." Jimmy took one long, deep breath, and on the soft purr of his exhale, it came. When he heard it land on his windowsill, he had to force himself to look. It was a snow owl. As Jimmy Ben watched, the owl gripped the windowsill with his claws and slowly opened his cotton-white wings. His wingspan was wider than Jimmy was tall, and he wanted the boy to know it. Relaxing his wings, the bird lifted a leg and dug his claw deep into the side of the window frame. As Jimmy watched, the owl scraped a long scar into the wood, marking it. Then he turned, cast a powerful scream into the night, and flew away. Jimmy's heart pounded like a wounded rabbit's. His breath came in hard, short gasps. He leapt out the window and followed the owl through the pine woods. The owl flew from one low limb to the next, then lifted high over the treetops before settling in a clearing. Jimmy was close behind, stepping over fallen logs and brushing low-hanging moss aside with his arms, moving as quickly as he dared in the darkness. When he arrived at the clearing, he crouched down, hiding in a clump of honeysuckle vines. The owl was sitting on a stump, gently lifting and lowering his wings. As Jimmy Ben watched with eyes as big as the moon, the owl flapped his wings and hovered 3 feet above the tree stump. He seemed to float there for several minutes. Then he stepped down on the stump with the legs of a man. It was the body of an owl and the legs of a man. Jimmy froze, too scared to breathe. The owl gazed slowly around the clearing, peering deep in the woods with his night-seeing eyes. Then he began to flap his wings again. Jimmy knew he wasn't going anywhere, not with the weight of a man's legs to carry. The owl flapped his wings faster and faster till the feathers started flying. He beat the air with his wings like he was striking out at somebody. Whoosh! Whoosh! Over and over he whipped his wings till all his feathers were floating in the air or lying on the ground. Jimmy saw white skin stretched across the wing bones of the owl. From under the skin, tiny fingers pushed and poked, then popped right through. Human arms stretched out, cracking and breaking the bones of the owl. It was the body of a man and the head of an owl. Jimmy wanted to run, but he knew he would be killed if he did. He watched as the owl man covered his head with his arms, then lifted his face. It was the face of a man with the eyes of an owl. Jimmy Ben knew this man. It was Tom Bigby. "Stay away from Tom Bigby," his daddy once told him. "His medicine is bad." Tom Bigby looked to Jimmy's hiding place and stepped clumsily from the stump in that direction. He had just regained his balance from the steep step down when the first light of day cast a yellow glow on the clearing. Shaking his head and moaning, Tom Bigby lifted an arm to shield his eyes and fled into the darkness of the swamp. He had a way of walking like nobody else Jimmy Ben had ever seen. With all that changin', he's gone and left part of himself somewhere else, he remembered his daddy saying. He didn't understand it at the time. Now he did. Tom's left leg seemed frozen at the knee joint, and his foot was twisted and dragged behind him like a yard broom when he walked. The old man used his bad leg like a crutch. Leaning all his weight on it, he would stretch and stomp out with the good leg and drag the other one behind him. Jimmy Ben waited till the man was gone, then dashed home, hoping his mother hadn't noticed he was gone. Barely 2 minutes after he climbed into bed, she stuck her head through the door. "Get up, son. Those weeds are growing while you sleep." He knew he was in for another long day of chopping corn. Jimmy Ben told nobody what happened that morning, nor did he mention it at supper. That night he had a terrible dream. He dreamed he followed that owl through the woods, and when they came to the clearing, the owl walked around the stump where Jimmy Ben couldn't see. The owl was pecking and clawing at something lying on the ground. When Jimmy crept from behind his hiding place to get a better look, he saw himself lying there. The owl was pecking out his eyes. Jimmy Ben screamed, and the owl looked up. The face of Tom Bigby glared at him and said, "You been following me?" The next thing he knew, Tom Bigby was on him, clawing at his face. He waved his arms and cried out, "No! Go away!" Tom Bigby grabbed his arms by the wrist and forced him to his side. "Wake up, Jimmy! You're having a nightmare." He opened his eyes and saw his father. "You are almost as strong as a man, son," he said. "You've been fighting me. Come on now. You can sleep in our room." Jimmy spent the remainder of the night on a pallet by his parents' bed. The next morning his mother took him to see Miss Tubby, a healing lady who lived on the edge of the swamp in a grove of cypress trees. Miss Tubby took Jimmy Ben to her backyard, gave him a cane basket, and said, "You got your knife with you?" When he nodded, she said, "Follow me." Miss Tubby was a fast walker, and Jimmy had to hurry to keep up. Once they passed a rattlesnake sunning on a rock. Jimmy slowed down to a whispering walk, but Miss Tubby kept right on. She didn't see it, thought Jimmy. It wasn't going to bother us, Miss Tubby said. After an hour of walking, they came to a narrow strip of land on the banks of a Clearwater Creek. A dozen cedar trees covered the tiny peninsula, most of them recent growth, but one large tree grew parallel to the ground. The base of the tree was scorched and scarred from an ancient battle with ball lightning. "Struck on the east side," Miss Tubby said. "The woods for miles around burned, but this old tree survived. It may be bent, but it's still living." Miss Tubby climbed over the tree. "Give me your knife," she said. She cut and sliced several lengths of bark till the basket was filled. Then she produced a small cup from her apron pocket and dipped it in the creek. "Good, clean water," she said, sipping slowly and handing Jimmy Ben the cup. He knelt to the creek to fill it, then saw she was already walking faster than before. He splashed one cup on his face and gulped down another as he ran to catch Miss Tubby. As they neared her house, she turned to him and said, "Your mother and I are going to visit on the porch. There's a fire hole in the backyard, not too far from the well. You'll find kindling by the barn. Let me know when the fire is burning low and steady." 30 minutes later, Jimmy walked around the house to find his mother slowly rocking, fanning herself with a feather fan. Miss Tubby sat with her head back and her mouth open, napping and snoring like his daddy's hunting dog. "Should I wake her up?" he asked his mother. "Don't be worrying about me," said Miss Tubby. "You ought to be worrying about leaving that fire." "Yes, ma'am," said Jimmy. He dashed to the fire, and she rose to follow. She tied the cedar strips to one end of a green pine branch and held it over the fire. When it was smoking, she circled Jimmy Ben, waving the smoke all around him, singing as she walked. "Lift your arms up over your head," she told him. She smoked Jimmy and sang for half an hour, then motioned for him to join her on the back porch steps. "That owl will come back for you," she said. "I have done everything I can do. You are strong. You must help yourself now. Keep working to the good and have faith that good will come of it." She stood up and, resting one hand on her thigh, helped herself up the steps and into the house. "Tell your mother I said goodbye," she said over her shoulder. For the first time that day, Jimmy saw that she was tired. "I may be tired, Jimmy Ben, but I can still outrun you," Miss Tubby said on her way to the bedroom. For the next 3 nights, Jimmy slept on the floor in his parents' room. When nothing out of the ordinary happened, he returned to his own bed. Every morning for a week, his mother asked about him. "Did you sleep well?" He would nod, and roll over for another hour of sleep before his father came for him. Jimmy Ben now slept better than before. He no longer woke up at 3 in the morning, and if he dreamed at all, he couldn't remember. Weeks went by, and Jimmy only thought about the owl a few times a day, usually at nightfall when the screech owls made their presence known. One morning, his grandfather stopped by for breakfast. While Jimmy cleared the dishes, he heard his grandfather say, "Somebody was telling me Tom Bigby was fishing for a few weeks down on the coast. They say he's back now. I expect maybe he's still keeping to himself in the woods, far as anybody knows. I've been talking to Miss Tubby about it." Jimmy's mother and father didn't say anything, but he saw them glance a quick look at each other. His father sipped his coffee, and his mother stared into her cup. "I brought something for Jimmy," his grandfather said. He walked to his horse and returned with a blow-dart gun. "Mind if I borrow him today? I'd like to show him how I used to hunt when I was a boy." "I hunt squirrels with my blow-dart," said Jimmy Ben. "Pretty good, sounds like," said his grandfather. "Maybe we go looking for rabbit today." "That'll be fine," said Jimmy's father. "Maybe you can stay over tonight if you like. We'll put an extra rabbit in the stew." "We'll catch that extra rabbit," said Jimmy Ben's grandfather, smiling as he said it. "Jimmy, these old legs don't go so fast no more. How about we take the horse?" Jimmy Ben climbed on behind his grandfather, and they rode north for an hour, to the woods below a group of low-lying hills. His grandfather dismounted, helped him off the horse, and said, "Let's sit and talk for a spell, Jimmy. I want to tell you about a different kind of hunting." He removed a handful of feathered darts from his saddlebag. One end of each was tipped with a sharp thorn. "Your blow-dart can protect you, Jimmy, if you learn to use it. A man-owl is after you. That's serious business. Don't think he's not coming back. He is. He never will leave you alone, not as long as he is alive." "What can I do?" "First off, do what Miss Tubby said. Keep working for the good. But that's not always enough. When Tom Bigby comes, you got to be ready. Now, let's see if we can find us a rabbit." Jimmy Ben followed his grandfather into a clump of golden sycamore trees. They had only walked a short distance when his grandfather held up his hand and pointed to a thick cedar bush. He reached for the gun, and Jimmy gave it to him. The old man loaded the gun and shifted into a crouch, moving without a sound. Jimmy Ben thought he saw movement, but he couldn't be sure. Then his grandfather drew in his breath and fired the dart, several feet to the left of the bush. At the same moment, a rabbit leapt from the cedar branches. He caught the dart in his neck, twisted in midair, and fell to the ground. "I didn't see the rabbit," Jimmy said. "I didn't either," said his grandfather. "That's the other part of what Miss Tubby told you. Go with your faith." Jimmy Ben and his grandfather spent the rest of the day moving quietly through the woods. Twice Jimmy halted and fired at movement in the undergrowth, but nothing came of it. "That's all right, grandson. It will be there when you need it," said his grandfather. The next morning, Jimmy's grandfather woke him. The boy lay on his back in bed with his eyes closed. His grandfather placed his hand on Jimmy's forehead and prayed in Choctaw for a long time. Jimmy's eyes were still closed when his grandfather saddled his horse and rode away. He knew, as did his grandfather, that the owl would come that night. By his parents' actions that day, Jimmy guessed that his grandfather had not alerted them to the owl's coming. This was something for Jimmy Ben to face alone. The day passed in a crawl as he tried to sweat out his fear, working with his hoe in the cornfield. He ate much slower than usual at supper. He felt like a distant witness to everything around him. After supper, he gathered dried husks from the corn crib and spread them beneath his window and in the yard on the side of the house as a noisy warning to himself. Jimmy went to bed early, his gun lying beside him on the floor. It was loaded with a dart his grandfather had dipped in the strongest poison he knew. He lay wide awake for hours, but finally became so wrapped up in his imaginings of sneaking owl-eyed Tom Bigby that he drifted over to the world of dreams. The real Tom Bigby woke him out of it. Jimmy's eyes popped open. He heard heavy breathing, then a stomping sound, followed by a long, dragging noise. Tom Bigby was approaching the house. Through his window he saw a full moon hanging in a cloudless sky, a bright yellow and blue vision on the wall of his bedroom. The sound came closer. A dry, rustling noise floated through the window as Tom Bigby dragged his bad leg through the corn husk. Then the moon disappeared, and the scraggly, bearded face of Tom Bigby rested on the windowsill. Jimmy Ben reached for his gun, and quick owl eyes followed the movement. Tom's face vanished. Thinking Tom Bigby might be crouching beneath his window, Jimmy scooted backwards, bracing himself against the far wall. He lifted the gun to his mouth and took in short breaths, ready to fire at any moment. Several minutes passed. Jimmy took a small step and moved to the window to get a better view. For a brief moment, he saw the yellow of the moon. A shadow flashed before it. Then Jimmy Ben heard the beating of wings. He saw a small white ball flying at him. Then giant wings spread across the moon, and Jimmy's room was cast in darkness. The owl drew in his wings, and the room was filled again with light. The owl flew directly in front of the moon, and with every beat of his wings, the room fluttered from light to darkness. With his sharp claws aimed at the eyes of the boy, the owl threw back his wings and sped into his dive. The window to the boy's room was just before him. Jimmy Ben was blinded by the flickering of darkness into light. He tried shading his eyes. He knew the owl was almost upon him. He could see nothing, but he could feel the wind from the owl's wings on his face. The time had come. He closed his eyes, drew in a breath, and fired. The dart whistled through the air, and the owl flew to meet it. A scream, half owl and half man, tore through the fabric of the yellow and blue night. The beating of wings ceased. Jimmy Ben ran to the window. Though everything appeared as a vague outline of shapes and shadows, he thought he saw the owl flapping his wings and rolling on the ground. The owl seemed to grow to the size of a small child and drag itself into the woods. As his vision cleared, he saw blood-stained white feathers strewn among the corn husk on the ground below his window. Jimmy Ben sat on the edge of his bed till he saw the first red streak of dawn through the pine trees. he placed his blow-dart gun against the window frame and went to wake his parents. "The owl is dead," he said, leaning his head through the doorway. "What?" said his father. "I shot the owl. He is dead. Will you go with me to the clearing?" Half an hour later, Jimmy led his father through the woods, following the same trail he had taken in pursuit of the owl a month earlier. Stepping into the clearing, he was amazed at how small everything seemed. The stump was barely 2 feet tall. As he and his father stood watching, the bright rays of dawn washed the entire woods in a clean, white light. Even Tom Bigby looked peaceful. He was lying dead at the base of the stump, a blow-dart in his neck. White feathers clung to the skin around the wound. Jimmy Ben and his family continued working to the good. Neither Tom Bigby nor any other witch owl ever bothered them again.